Everyone. Today we will be talking about a very important topic about research designs and research methods, and that is the issue associated with internal and external validity. A big question I think that I get a lot of times within a research methods class is who really cares about internal and external validity? How does this impact me? How does it impact my study? How does it impact the quality of the work that we're putting out into our scientific discipline? And the answer to that question is very, very important. And to be honest, it's a difficult question to sometimes answer, but it is a very important question to answer. Throughout our lecture for today, I will be hopefully trying to tackle that question. And hopefully by the end of our lecture today, you will have a greater appreciation and understanding of internal and external validity and why they're so important for us in terms of the work that we do in terms of our field of psychology. So to begin with our work associated with internal and external validity, we kind of have to go back to the beginning associated with how research programs work. Now, when we think about a research program, what do we mean by a research program? We're talking about the way that we think about the work that we're doing within our field. So in other words, for myself, I'm a cognitive psychologist. More specifically, I'm a psycholinguist. My area of concentration is in bilingualism and language comprehension and language production. So in other words, what I do is I stick to those particular topics. So for me, it's very important that the quality of the work that I'm putting out is going to be a good quality work that it's going out into my scientific discipline, because the work that I'm putting out into the field is essentially going to impact the field. Now, I hope that it's going to have a major impact in the field. It may possibly not, and more than likely it's not going to have a major impact within the field, and I'm okay with that. But to be honest with you, it is important for us to be able to know and understand that we are using that work well. Myself, I'm constantly trying to make sure that I am conducting multiple research studies. And again, all those parts of those multiple research studies are all working up in terms of an organization to formulate theories, to formulate greater quality work that I'm putting out into the field, and making sure that that contribution that I'm making to the field itself is actually a beneficial contribution. So in other words, what I don't want to do is I don't want to put out work into my field and go to have presentations, have publications, but now all of a sudden people are criticizing my work or they're critiquing my work too harshly because I haven't paid sufficient detail to the quality of the work that I'm putting out. So in other words, I may have used an unrepresentative sample, I may have used techniques that are invalid, I may have used techniques that are no longer something that is even remotely associated with the population, because that does happen. And we will talk about some of those particular issues a little bit later on in our lecture. So again, we have to remember that as we are developing ourselves as researchers, we develop our own research agenda or our own research program. So we in psychology are essentially a programmatic field. And what that means is that every single research study that we're putting out contributes to that larger theory, that contributes to the larger aspect associated with our field and our understanding of that specific phenomenon of interest. So for myself, every single one of my research studies that I do associated with language, or that I do associated with memory and language comprehension and language production, add to the quality of that work and add to the amount of work that we're putting out in developing that theory. So pretty much what we're trying to do here, and if we really look at it from this perspective, we have a puzzle that we're working on, and every single one of our research studies is a small puzzle piece that hopefully is going to give us a larger understanding of the whole picture. And hopefully by us completing more and more of these puzzle pieces, in other words, these research studies, that is going to be able to give us a clear understanding of the theory and understanding of the puzzle itself, and all together gives us a good explicit organization. Now, when we think about research being programmatic, that idea of it being programmatic and us having a research agenda and program really does then drive us to being able to understand what it is that we're going to be doing in terms of our work. Now, more specifically, what that means, now we can create short-term and long-term research pursuits. So what is my long-term research pursuit as a cognitive psychologist within the field of psycholinguistics? What are my short-term pursuits in terms of the research studies that I'm currently doing at this moment? And as anything that we would do within any research discipline, and even within making a puzzle, there has to be a logical progression that we are going to have in terms of the quality of the work that we're doing. So in other words, when you're working on a puzzle, you don't start on one little corner and then drop that corner and then go to another corner and then go to another corner and then go to another corner, or start right in the middle or anything like that, but rather you continue to work on that corner until it develops and forms more and larger and larger and larger an understanding of that specific puzzle. And then from there, you can begin to work on other puzzle pieces as well. Now, when we are looking at trying to develop research programs and trying to develop research studies in themselves, we again have to understand also what we call the progression of science. In terms of the progression of science, we actually have 4 steps that we follow. Step number 1 is making sure that we even have what we call an observable event. So in other words, that we can conclude or we can answer the question, how does this effect actually occur? So in other words, this shouldn't be something that is based on supposition. It shouldn't be anything that's based on intuition, but rather it should be something that we have actually observed and that we have questions about. So in other words, why does it rain when it's cloudy? That is something that we've observed, and we've observed that there's a relationship of when it rains, when it's cloudy. That is something that we can then work on because we have actually observed that potential effect. From there, we are going to identify what we call moderators. Moderators are going to try to answer the questions when, where, and for whom do the effect occur. So when it is cloudy and it is this amount of cloudiness or darkness associated with the clouds, or we have this amount of precipitation within the clouds themselves, we generally tend to find that it rains. So for us in psychology, we might say something to the degree of when somebody studies 6 hours versus studying for 8 hours, the person who studies for 8 hours actually has better grade performance than the person who studies for 6 hours. But then at that point, we stop right there, and all that we're identifying is what we're going to call a moderator. And again, what does that moderator mean? It just means that we're identifying when, where, or for whom does that effect occur. Third, we're now going to try to identify what we call a mediator. A mediator is going to try to answer the why question for us, because again, that is a logical progression in terms of science. That we're going to ask, why does that effect actually occur? So why is it that when somebody studies for 8 hours versus when they study for 6 hours, they actually perform better on the exam than the person who studied for 6 hours? Now, that answer may potentially be biological. It may be something that is more covert than it is actually overt. And remember, with our covert behaviors, we're talking about things that we are not able to physically see, but rather they are things that we may have to develop some type of tool or technique or paradigm to be able to extract that information to then be able to make it overt in those particular situations. And then fourth, we're going to try to identify and establish definitive causality. So here, definitively saying that our independent variable definitively does cause our dependent variable. So in other words, we always find that when people study for 8 hours, they always perform better than people who study for 6 hours because of retention ability of the person who studied for 8 hours versus the person who studied for 6 hours. So here, when we try to establish definitive causality, we're essentially saying that we're eliminating all of the possibilities of all other possible factors, and we're only sticking to one single response and saying it's because of this particular reason. Now, this for us, step number 4, in terms of trying to establish definitive causality, is very, very important for us because this goes in line with the idea of internal validity. Now, with the idea of internal validity is this idea here that we have a very controlled situation. And if I have a very controlled research situation and I'm making sure that all other factors are consistent with each other's, the only difference between my two groups is the amount of studying habits that they have. So in other words, one group studies for 6 hours, one group studies for 8 hours, but everything else is equivalent across both of my groups in terms of age of the participants, gender of the participants, socioeconomic status, level of education, etc., etc., etc. Everything else is equal between the two groups, and the only difference that we have between them is my independent variable, my manipulation, or my control. Then hopefully I'll then be able to establish definitive causality. That relates back to the issue again of internal validity, making sure that I have a well-controlled research situation. In other words, reducing what we call error variance, ERROR variance. Reducing that idea of error variance is going to be very important for us in terms of all research designs, in terms of all research procedures. What does it mean to have error variance? It means differences between my scores that are not due to the researcher's manipulation or control. So in other words, group 1 and group 2, yes, they may study 6 hours, and yes, they may study for 8 hours, but group 1, who studies for 6 hours, their average age is 72, and for group 2, who study for 8 hours, their average age is 25. Potentially that factor there of age might contribute to the differences that we see in terms of the group performance, when in reality it might be due to the independent variable that we manipulate, but now we have concerns because it could potentially be due to something else that's creating those differences in our scores. So again, that is a very, very big issue for us, and we're going to try to talk, or we will talk about that in just a couple of more minutes. Now, whenever it is that we're developing research ideas and we're thinking about coming up with a research study that we're interested in following up with, one of the biggest obstacles that we always encounter is what we call the Einstein syndrome. Now, we all know who Albert Einstein is. We all are familiar with his work and so on and so forth, and with the contributions that he made to science in terms of the field of physics and so on and so forth. But it's a very big common misperception for us that all our work has to be as impactful as to the work of what Einstein did. So, in other words, yes, Einstein may have had great contributions in his field. Yes, Einstein may have changed the way that we thought about certain topics within his discipline. But that doesn't necessarily mean that I, as a scientist, have to have that exact same effect within the field of psychology. Now, I hope that I have that effect, right? So, in other words, when I die, I hope that on my tombstone it says, wow, he changed the way that we think of psychology. Is that really going to happen? The answer is going to be probably not. And that's okay, because you know why? I'm setting the groundwork, I'm setting the foundation for others to use my work to potentially make those major breakthroughs. So, in reality, do I have to always have major breakthroughs? And the answer is no. I don't always have to do that. If every single research study was a major breakthrough for us within the field of psychology, we'd be having thousands upon millions of breakthroughs every single year, and it'd be too difficult for us to catch up and really have any trust or value within the quality of the work that we're doing. But rather, what do? We all work on programmatic research. So, in other words, we are all adding to the evidence that we have associated with that theory to hopefully one day potentially make that breakthrough, potentially ourselves or potentially a colleague of ours in the future. So for us, we really use, instead of having this idea of having major breakthroughs, we're going to use what we call the gradual synthesis model of research. What does that mean? That we're taking baby steps towards that idea of a breakthrough. So in other words, we are having smaller discoveries every single time that we're conducting a research study, and hopefully that's going to lead to a major breakthrough within the future. And again, we also follow the idea of what we call converging operations. What does that mean? It means that we have to come to a realization that we are not the only ones who have an interest within this specific topic associated with our work. So it would be ridiculous for me to assume that I am the only cognitive psychologist in the entire world who has an interest in bilingualism and in psycholinguistics, and who cares and does research on language acquisition, language formation, comprehension, and memory processes associated with language. That would be ridiculous. But rather, the thousands upon millions of us out there in the world who are potentially doing work related to what I'm currently doing. So instead of me trying to have major breakthroughs every single research study, together as a collaborative unit, we are all working on research projects. We're all developing puzzle pieces for the puzzle that are hopefully now going to allow us to make those major breakthroughs. Now, as again we would say here, it's rather that we are making smaller discoveries rather than having major breakthroughs. And again, we're okay with that idea of having that gradual synthesis model of research. Hopefully, all that we're doing is we're paving the way for those in the future to be able to use our work. Just as the way that we've used the work of others in the past, people in the future are going to use our work to potentially make those larger breakthroughs. So, a big issue that we have to concern ourselves with is, what does it mean that we actually completed a research study? So, what is it that my research study actually contributes to the field? In many instances, people get lost in this idea of what our research studies actually are able to do for the field. Sometimes people think that our work makes too much of an impact, versus other times people don't think that our work makes any impact. So, in some instances, researchers are publishing work that may be low quality. In other instances, they may be publishing work where they think that they're making greater contributions than what they are actually in reality doing. And that is important for us to keep ourselves grounded and keep that into perspective in terms of what it is that our research studies are actually able to produce or provide for our fields. So, in terms of our research studies, one of the things that we always have to kind of keep in mind is the following. Each individual research study that we do tests a specific number of hypotheses. Those hypotheses use a very limited number of samples. They also use a very limited context or situation where the data has been collected. And third, they use a very specific and limited operational definition in terms of the way that we've defined our constructs of interest. So what we want to do is we want to go beyond this point of where we say, my research study only pertains to individuals who are between the ages of 18 to 25, who go to this specific university in this specific country, and who study for this specific number of hours. But rather, what we want to do is we want to go further, because what we want to do is we want our work to be generalized to the population. What do we mean to be generalized to the population? We're talking about external validity. So what we want to do is we want to be able to provide answers. Now, one of the things that we have to consider is that the research studies that we're doing, each one of those puzzle pieces that we're adding to the puzzle, gives us some answers, but it doesn't give us all the answers. So think of individual puzzle pieces. They give you some information, but they don't give you all the information. They also provide you with more questions. So now that you put that puzzle piece in the place where it goes, now it leaves you for other questions, and the other questions are, where's the other piece that fits into those puzzle pieces? So here, every single research study is providing us with limited amount of information. It gives us some answers, but it leaves us with an opportunity to answer more questions, because one of the things that we're always wanting to do is we're always wanting to strive for more. We're always wanting to strive to answer more and more questions. And that is one of the beauties associated with research, that we never run out of questions. So if you ever at some point in time feel to yourself, I've already exhausted all possible questions that I could potentially answer, I've already answered everything out there, I have answered the puzzle, I'm going to be honest with you, you're probably wrong. There's probably other questions that are out there. You just have to become creative in terms of the way that you actually explore those questions. So here, this quote, I really do like this quote a lot. Artists and scientists realize that no solution is ever final, but that each new creative step points the way to the next artistic or scientific problem. And that is definitely the way that we pursue the idea of science, that we're always looking for the next thing. We're always looking for the next answer that's out there. And we're always looking for the next puzzle that needs to be solved. Even if we think that the puzzle has actually been solved, believe me, the puzzle has never been solved, especially with the way that our world changes and the way our world evolves every single day. That is definitely something that we always have to consider, that this idea of the context that we're collecting data in can drastically change from being in the real world to now being on social media platforms. That changes the way that we are going to understand that phenomenon of interest as well. So when we're doing research studies, another major issue that always comes across is this idea of magic bullets. So what do we mean by magic bullets? It means that it goes back to this idea of trying to establish definitive causation, where sometimes people assume that we can give one single causal explanations. So the problem itself can be answered by one single causal mechanism. So in other words, there is one single answer that allows me to be able to answer that question that you have. This is very, very common, especially whenever it is that people are asking questions about behavior. People will come up to you, especially when they find out that you are doing research in psychology, or that you are a psychologist, or that you're getting your degrees in psychology. Somebody will come up to you and say, okay, how do I improve my grades? That's a tough question to answer, to be honest with you. Or somebody comes up to you and says, my child has ADD, how do I correct that? That is an incredibly difficult question to answer. Or how does my child improve academically when they suffer from this learning disorder? And again, those are very, very difficult questions to answer. And in reality, there's not one single answer that really allows us to be able to answer that one single question. So here, when we think about psychological phenomenon in their entirety, they are very, very complex. And again, going back to the idea of the puzzle has thousands upon thousands of puzzle pieces, and what we're trying to do is we're trying to understand something like ADD from a psychological perspective, and it's not made up of one single puzzle piece, but it's made up of thousands or millions of puzzle pieces, and each one of those represents a research study, and it represents an independent variable and a dependent variable that we're examining in those situations. So very rarely, if ever, do we find that something is caused in psychology by one single thing. But in reality, we find that there are multiple factors that produce these effects both additively and interactively. So in other words, when you go to your doctor and your doctor says, are you on any medications? Are you taking anything else? Are you taking any drugs of any kind? Do you drink? Do you smoke? And you wonder why they ask those questions. They ask those questions because if they prescribe you certain medications, those medications may have an additive or an interactive effect with other things that you're taking, so they want to make sure that you're not taking those things, so that way you can actually have an increase in the likelihood of the medication that they're giving you in actually being effective. Because if not, it may potentially not be, or you may feel too much of an effect also because they may provide you with an additive effect. So our favorite explanation whenever it is that we encounter situations where people are asking us questions about psychological phenomenon and they want to know why something happens, our favorite answer is always, it depends. I remember a number of years ago, as I had an intro to psychology student when I was covering topics associated with drugs and behavior and memory. I had a student that asked me, sir, what happens when you drink 2 beers, you smoke a joint, you do a little bit of ecstasy, you haven't slept for 24 hours, what happens to your memory performance? And all I could do was just look at him and be in awe, because I was like, that is incredible that you would ever come up with that question. And the answer to that question was, it depends. And why does it depend? Because it depends on so many different factors. It depends on your height, it depends on your weight, it depends on your gender, it depends on your dependence, it depends on how many times you've gone through withdrawal, it depends on your tolerance. It depends on thousands of thousands and thousands of factors that we haven't even tackled about the drugs themselves. So here, when I went into that explanation, the student just goes, oh, forget it. Well, yeah, they generally want to forget about it because now it becomes too complex for them to deal with. And even something as simple as how are you going to do on the upcoming exams? That's a tough question to answer. And why? Because it depends on so many different factors. Sleep, eating behavior. It depends on if you read the textbook, if you've been listening to the lectures, this and that, and so on and so forth. So now it becomes a very, very difficult process. So when we think about all of these factors more globally, and we want to now understand where internal and external validity come into play, we now have to consider the differences between the two. So when we think about internal validity, what does this refer to? It refers back to the issue when we're trying to establish definitive causation in step number 4 in the progression of science, where we're talking about how well can we control extraneous factors in your research situation. What do we mean by extraneous factors? We mean third variables, we mean confounding factors, so confounds. We also call this error variance. So in other words, what we want to do is we want to reduce or control factors that might possibly contribute to differences in my scores that are not due to the researcher's manipulation or control. So again, remember, with error variance, we are talking about differences in our scores that are not due to the researcher's manipulation or control. With internal validity, we're saying that we're controlling these potential factors, and what we're trying to do is now we're trying to leave ourselves with what we call effect variance. What do we mean by effect variance? We're talking about differences in our scores that are due to the researcher's manipulation or control. So again, if we're coming up with this situation where we're comparing 6 hours versus 8 hours of studying, but we have all these other factors that might potentially contribute to our study performance or our exam performance as a whole, those factors are going to be considered error variance, and they're going to be a threat to internal validity. But if we control all those factors, so again, group 1, their average age is 18, they've slept for 24 hours in total, they've done X, Y, Z, and group 8 hours of studying are exactly identical to them, then they all cancel each other out, and the only thing that's left is my effect variance, because that's my manipulation, the 6 hours or the 8 hours of studying that I'm controlling in that particular situation. Now, when we think about extraneous variables, the extraneous variables are essentially competing with our independent variables for explaining the outcome of my research study. So again, the differences in our scores that are not due to the researcher's manipulation and control. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to reduce the effect of these potential confounding variables, because what I want to be able to do is I want to be able to use my independent variable as the mechanism to explain the effect that we saw, that we observed on my dependent variable. So what we can try to do now is we want to try to reduce this. How do we reduce that? Well, we reduce that by making sure that everybody is equivalent before the research studies begin. We want to make sure that the people who say that they are actually enrolled in that class are actually enrolled in that class, that they've been attending the same amount of hours as everybody else, and so on and so forth. So we as researchers are constantly in worry about extraneous variables, because again, we realize that they may have detrimental, or not that they may, but that they will have detrimental effects on the conclusions that I'm drawing about my research study. So how can I as a researcher be confident in my work if I may potentially have all these confounds that are actually explaining the differences between my scores and not due to my effect variance, but rather due to my error variance? And I don't want that to happen, but rather I want to be able to go out into my scientific community and be able to let people know that the differences between 6 and 8 hours of studying are actually due to 6 and 8 hours of studying for these particular reasons, not to Mary Jane having studied for an extra 10 hours in the 6-hour group, and that may have contributed to better performance for the 6-hour group than for the 8-hour group. So when we think about now internal validity in terms of what it can do, now we turn our attention to thinking about external validity. And what is external validity? Now that is how well my results can actually apply to the general population. The idea of what we're talking about, generalizability. So here we're not necessarily talking about doing field research or anything like that, but rather we're talking about how it is that my work can now be actually representative of the population. And when I take my work into the population, I should see similar results to what I saw in the laboratory setting. Now I should be able to see that out in the population, no longer using the sample, but now integrating my work into the population. So now, even though we may look at field research as having higher external validity, and it does because you're already doing the work out in the real world, you don't necessarily have to always do field research to be able to look at the aspect of generalizability. You can look at generalizability by doing the work in the lab, making sure that you have a high degree of internal validity, and then taking that work and implementing it into the real world situation and seeing if we find similar results. If we do see that same result, that makes us happy, because again here we're now taking the work that we've done in the lab under controlled situations and now using the real world, which obviously has confounding factors that exist out there that I am not in control of. So in other words, the real world has higher degrees of error variance than the laboratory settings do. But now if I see similar results, that makes me very confident in terms of my work, that the work that I'm doing in the lab is being now replicated out in the real world, and it actually generalizes and can be applied to the general population, and we still find similar results. So what is the relationship between the two? Again, we just mentioned that here, that they are working together in terms of the work that we do in the lab now should be taken out and be able to be implemented into the real world situation, and we should see similar results. If we don't, now we have to understand why there may potentially be a problem. Again, that may be due to a third factor, it may be due to a compound. It's just that potentially the likelihood of having error variance in our research studies. I thought about it after I had mentioned it to you all at the beginning, and then I thought about it, and I was like, that's not really not fair for me to give out attendance sheets. I know that you guys are busy, and that in some instances you're not going to be able to make it to class, but you are responsible enough to know that you have to be coming to class, or that you at least have to be viewing the videos and keeping up with the material that we're covering. So I just decided that I wasn't going to do it and not have it really be a part of your grade or anything. So rather, I'm just looking at the aspects of for participation, the discussion board, and then also I can tell who is here and who's not here, because you all are very much creatures of habit and you all sit in the same place. So so I get to know exactly who's where, so I can at least determine that aspect quite easily. So if I start noticing that someone's not present quite frequently, alarming to me or a concern. But I'm also not going to be hounding you guys and being after you and saying like, hey, you're not coming to class and you're not emailing me or you're not emailing me or whatever the case may be. So I just decided that I was going to not do that. Yep, good question though. Other questions? All right, so let's go ahead and continue on with our discussion associated with internal and external validity. So when we look at this aspect of internal validity, the major question I guess that we end up having associated with internal validity is what's really the point of me establishing internal validity? And the reason that we want to establish internal validity is because we really unambiguously want to conclude that my IV caused my DV. Because remember, in point number four, the progression of science, I really want to definitively establish causation. And if you remember that we've covered already the conditions of causality given to us by David Hume, and again, those were temporal precedents. We also talked about internal validity, and we also talked about the covariation rule. It was very important for us to be able to establish this aspect of definitive causality, and also to have a good experimental research design that would allow me to draw causal conclusions. Because if you recall, one of the four criteria associated with determining or establishing to have a true experimental research design was the aspect of internal validity. That we looked at the issues of having a true random sample, true random assignment, a true manipulated independent variable, and then having true internal validity. In other words, having that high degree of internal control associated with my research situations. So here we continuously see that this aspect of internal validity keeps being brought up time and time again in different in different research situations, let that be the research design, let that be in the conclusions that we're drawing, whatever the case may be, that it seems to be a very important factor for us to consider in terms of this aspect of wanting to make sure that we have true and valid results. So thus the aspect of having true internal validity, referring to this issue of I have a high degree of control over my research situation, refers back to this issue of I can draw the correct conclusions and then hopefully, potentially draw the conclusion of causation later on, because that's what I ultimately want to do with internal validity. I want to draw the conclusion of causation in where I say that my independent variable is truly having a causal effect on my dependent variable. Questions so far? Perfect. So when we think of internal validity, and why is it that we really want to establish internal validity and why it's so important for us, it's really often done in research in order for us to determine the cause and effect relationship. So that's really why we want to try to establish definitive causality, so that way I can eliminate the potential effect of other causal mechanisms as potentially explaining my result. And ultimately what I want to be left with is I only want to be left with effect variance. In other words, differences between my groups that are due to the researcher's manipulation or control and not due to other factors such as error or variance that it may be due to other factors that I am not in control of. In other words, I want the differences really to be due to my treatment and my manipulation and not due to other potential factors. So we want to have good conclusions. We don't want to have poor conclusions, because if we have poor conclusions that are not necessarily valid, why is that so important to me? Why do I not want to have poor conclusions or non-valid conclusions? Non-valid conclusions. Your research wouldn't be good. Okay. What else? Because you might use the results of your conclusions out in the real world, and if they're not right, that's a huge problem. Absolutely. We don't want to be a pharmaceutical company who makes a bad drug. What else? Think of something more personal to you. Do people want to think of you as a good researcher or a bad researcher? Of course, you want to be a good researcher. You don't want your name to be tainted in the research literature, and then anytime you submit any publication, let that be the best publication that you've ever written, you don't want people to look at that publication and be like, oh, that's so-and-so. You know, they did some pretty crappy work last time. More than likely, they did crappy work this time. Everyone with me so far? So here we start noticing now that there's lots of possible results that may occur because of you having bad internal validity and not supporting this aspect of controlling potential compounds and extraneous variables, but rather we want to have a high degree of internal validity so that way at least I can confidently establish that there are not other mechanisms that are potentially affecting my results. So we want to have good evidence of causality, and by having a high degree of internal validity, we hopefully are going to be able to establish that. So when we think of the conditions of causality, here are our 3 conditions of causality one more time. Very, very important. I don't know, I've probably mentioned them, like 4 times during the 4 weeks that we've had class. They are probably going to come up on the exam. Probably. They will come up on the exam. So here are the 3 conditions of causality. Number 1. We have the condition of covariation. And here there are no specific order, so it doesn't really matter which one you pick first. Covariation. A change in A is accompanied by a change in B. Number 2, temporal precedence. A must precede B. So in other words, A, your manipulation or your independent variable, has to come before B, your dependent variable. And last, some mechanism can be posited to explain the causal effect of A and B, and alternative explanations are rolled out. In other words, we have the internal validity rule. In other words, we control extraneous or third or confounds, and thus are only left with effect variance. So, in terms of internal validity, is it plausible that we can have 100% internal validity? No, you're right. We can't. We're never going to have 100% internal validity. But rather, what are we going to do? We're going to try our best to achieve 100% internal validity, controlling as many potential factors as we can, having a flawless study, but yet we're not going to have a flawless study. And any study that ever claims to be flawless, they're lying to you. Because here, it's normal for us to have potential flaws, not disastrous, fatal flaws in our research studies, but at least everyone has limitations. Everyone has issues with internal validity. That is normal. So why do we prefer to use experimental research designs? Well, because we want to believe what we prefer to be true. And Sir Francis Bacon essentially told us that. He essentially said, man prefers to believe what he prefers to be true. In other words, if I can definitively establish causation, and I can tell you that this is proof, this is causal mechanisms, that's what we believe, because people believe what they want to believe. Right? That's what ends up happening. People believe what they want to believe. So it's up to us to being able to produce the belief and to produce the results that are believable and they are valid. And if we can approach causality and have good internal validity and have good valid results, that's what we want to push out to the general population, and that's what we also want to push out to our psychological community, so that way people understand what is true and what is valid. Questions so far? This goes back to the example I gave you all about Good Morning America for my major advisor, my major professor in graduate school. Here, the word was taken of somebody who has a bachelor's degree in psychology who doesn't really know too much about how complex human behavior actually is, besides just what they learned at the undergraduate level, doesn't practice any aspect of psychological processes or psychological theory in the real world, but yet that's seen as truth versus someone who potentially might be an expert. Because here, somebody did bring up a very good point in one of their discussion boards that said, just because you have a PhD doesn't make it true and doesn't make it that you're an expert, and that is absolutely true, because there are people who have PhDs out there who should not have PhDs. That is absolutely true as well. Questions so far? Questions? Perfect. So, when is it that internal validity becomes too complicated for us? Well, the real answer and the real problem here that exists is that there are just too many things that we need to consider in terms of internal validity. And we might potentially get caught up trying to minimize extraneous confounds and third variables effects and not focusing on our own project and not focusing on the good aspects associated with our research designs. So in other words, people get too caught up trying to have a flawless project that they don't realize that they should be working on trying to design the best project that they can with the best materials that they can possibly get their hands on, and don't worry so much about other possible factors, because there may be factors out there that don't even necessarily affect our results, but we in our crazy minds sometimes think that they might. I can't tell you how many times people have told me, oh, it's because we didn't have an equivalent amount of males and females in our groups. So? What does that matter? Were you looking at gender as a potential confound? No. Okay, well then we're good. I really don't see what the problem is. I mean, why are you going to consider gender? Well, what about their age? People were between 18 to 23. All right, we're solid. They all don't have to be 18 years old and have the same birth date. Hell, if you got twins, you'd still complain. So here, at the end of the day, we can't worry too much about internal validity, but we should worry enough to try to do our best. There is no project out there that's flawless, like I just mentioned. Your projects will never be flawless. Each study is different. Each study needs to be considered its own beast if you want to think about it. And why? Because each project is its own individual project, and it comes with a new set of problems and a new set of issues that you need to address. And you cannot always use the same techniques across different populations and across different groups of samples that you get from that population, or even different techniques across different countries because of language barriers. Man, you have to consider so many factors, but you just can't have one technique that's the best, because there is no one single best technique. We saw that in terms of qualitative versus quantitative, lab versus field, applied versus basic, within versus between. We saw these problems. So here, all of them come with limitations. They all come with advantages. So here, pick whatever is best to answer your specific question. So what's the best definition that we can actually come up with in terms of internal validity? It's the following. The extent to which we can say the results from a study is, in fact, caused or determined by the manipulation of the independent variable rather than some other variable. In other words, the confidence that I have in being able to say, I trust that my results are due to my manipulation or control and not due to other factors. Everyone with me so far? The term extent is what transmits that idea of confidence. We're not saying perfectly how well your results from a study, but rather the extent. So in other words, it's on a magnitude scale here. We try our best, but potentially we may not have 100% confidence. But as long as you have a good amount of confidence, I'll believe you if you can convince me. Questions up to now? Everyone good? Perfect. So when we think of internal validity, what are some potential problems that we may not even consider that might have an effect on internal validity? And to be honest, there's quite a few. Here, I've just given you 10 of them. These are the main 10 that we typically talk about in textbooks. But as you encounter research situations and as you go through and do your own research studies, or even your own situations on where you're dealing with when you're dealing with human participants, you're going to notice that there are other factors that might potentially affect internal validity. So here are just a quick 10 that I've identified and that also textbooks have identified for you. Number 1, history. What does it mean to have history as a threat to internal validity? It essentially means that there's something that may happen on a global scale that we are not in control of that might potentially change my dependent variables measurements between the measurement times. So think about the following situation. Back in the late 90s, early 2000s, especially after Rodney King, we started noticing that even though there was prejudice in our country, we started noticing that prejudice levels kind of were starting to decrease. We're saying that prejudice was eliminated, so don't ever think that we've always gone along. That's not realistic. But rather, what are we saying here? We are saying that prejudice levels, people were starting to get along with each other a little bit more, a little bit better and than what we had seen in previous years. So we started seeing declines, and then right around, I don't know, I would say September 11th of 2001, we saw like this huge spike in prejudice happen. Why? Because of 9/11, right? And to be honest, here in our society, it was acceptable to be prejudiced for a while, wasn't it? Y'all remember that? Y'all don't want to admit it, but it's still kind of acceptable to be prejudiced towards, for instance, Middle Eastern groups. It's awkward, isn't it? But it's the truth. If you all remember, it was very, very clearly written for us. I mean, back in right after 2001. I mean, once we found out who the terrorists were, oh man, we started labeling people, number one, as terrorists. People started getting beat up for no good reason just because they might have potentially looked as like if they were Muslim or Middle Eastern. And it was acceptable. Oh, they beat them up. Good. They're protecting America. We would even say things like that. You guys remember the freedom fries? Because France was against us, the whole idea of us going to war. So we took that as an offense and screw the French. We're going to call them freedom fries. We got rid of wine that was coming in from France too. And then we wonder why other countries don't like us, right? The wine, right? The wine is what hurt, right? You're like, oh, I have to drink this stuff that comes from California. Mm. It sounds familiar, right, guys? So, I think the person who said it the best was Chris Rock. You all know Chris Rock, the comedian? He had this whole bit about it. And he would say, oh, man, right after 9/11, it was acceptable, to hate Muslims, And we would say, oh, whatever. You would say, racially insensitive. I won't repeat what he said, but you would say racially insensitive groups. And for a while there, it was acceptable. And then Chris Rock says that they moved on to other ethnic groups. He's like, and then it was Hispanics. And they were like, oh, let's build a border wall. You guys remember when the border wall started getting told that we were going to get it built? Do you remember that? Where I used to work at UT Brownsville. UT Brownsville's campus was located exactly, I don't know, I would say about a quarter of a mile from the border wall. So from my office, I used to look out into the border wall. I used to park next to the border wall. Can you guys still hear me? Okay. I used to park right next to the border wall. So, we had an overt symbol of prejudice every day on our campus. And we just grew used to it. But Chris Rock would say, oh, and then, we started attacking Hispanics and, oh, we're going to stop immigration and stop doing this. He said, and once they got to Hispanics, I was kind of like, okay, hey, stop, because I know who's next. And who was next? African Americans. So he was like, it was acceptable when it was Muslims. It was acceptable when it was Hispanics. But hey, don't get to my ethnic group because that's not okay. Everyone with me so far? So here we see now this global change, or in our particular history for our country, it's a change that happens that doesn't account for what should have potentially happened. What should have potentially happened in my dependent variable? Prejudice levels should have continued to decrease. But this incident makes it increase and have that sharp turn. So here, this historical event now changes my measurement. Everyone with me so far? Questions up to now? Number 2, what we call maturation. Maturation essentially means that your samples naturally change between measurements. So as we grow older, the idea of us maturing, the same thing happens to my samples. My samples naturally change with time. Why? Well, because things happen in between my measurements, unless my measurements are every 5 minutes. But if they're a week, 2 weeks, a year, 5 years, 10 years down the line, between one to another measurement, the sample is naturally going to change. Why? Because we get older, we get wiser, we become more educated, our health problems may be now important to us, etc., etc., etc. Everyone with me so far? I was mentioning you all about my. Did I tell you all that what my wife does? That she's a dentist. Did I tell you all what my wife does? That she's a dentist. Oh, okay, so my wife is a dentist. So my wife has had patients, for a long time. She's been practicing for 10 years. So she says that she still sees some of her patients that she had 10 years ago, and it's great. And she says it's incredible how they mature and how they evolve. And why? Well, because when they were 5 or even 7 years old, little kids don't care too much about brushing their teeth, guys. They don't care about brushing their teeth. They care about eating candy and eating Cheetos. That's what they like. But now, she says, now they're 16, 17, and now they're starting to get interested in little girls and little boys. And hey, I don't want my breath to smell. I don't want them to have ugly teeth. I care now about my dental hygiene. And my wife was like, you didn't care about them 10 years ago. And you were all about Cheetos back then. Now you're like, whoa. I got to brush my teeth after the Cheetos. So here, if we were considering something like the importance of dental hygiene, we would expect that people would remain consistent across their entire lifespans. Well, of course not, because people are naturally going to change. That's the idea of maturation, and we have to consider that as a threat to internal validity. Questions up to now? Number 3, what we call regression to the mean. Regression to the mean essentially means your extreme scores. In statistics, what do we call extreme scores? Outliers, exactly right. The abnormal people that we deal with, right? The statistically infrequent. Those values that are abnormal in their nature or extreme now become less extreme and become much more normal. So in other words, they start looking a lot like everybody else. So in other words, what do they look like in terms of the general population? Think back to when you were in high school. In high school, you didn't know responsibilities. Oh, I'm living my life day to day. Bless you. Did somebody sneeze? Okay, good, because if not, it would just sound as silly. Um, so here, when you're in high school, you're completely different, and sometimes you're even radical. I still remember, guys, when I was in high school, I was all about bringing the man down. Oh, bring down big government. Oh, I don't like big government. Bring down the man. Let's all be socialists. And now I'm like, well, hold on. I don't know about that. I like some things about socialism. Still like that. I'm not as extreme anymore on it. But for instance, there's other things that I'm like, well, let's not do that. Hold on. Crazy 18-year-old me would right now be like, you suck, man. You're such a square. Well, here, why? Well, because as you grow older, part of the maturation process is that you become less extreme in your ideologies. You become less extreme in your performance. People who have great mental ability, for instance, who have this great quality to remember information, who are just abnormal in comparison to the normal population, as adults, as very much older adults, they go through the same cognitive changes that we all do. So what happens there? Now they become less extreme and they become much more normal in terms of their memory capacity. It's a normal part of life. But again, it's a threat. We weren't accounting for that change, but it happens. Number 4, testing. Whenever it is that we look at the completion of the dependent variable at time 1 is going to affect how the dependent variable at time 2 is going to be affected. We talked about this a little bit with within groups research designs. We talked about that threat of practice effects. You guys remember that? Very similar here. Essentially, if you give them the same assessment at time 1 and then the same assessment at time 2, scores are going to naturally change because of things like practice or because they also figure out what the task was supposed to be all about. And that's a very important thing to realize. So remember, we talked about this issue of hiding the intent, so eliminating face validity, hiding the intent of your assessment tool. Well, what happens when people realize what the assessment tool measures after time 1? At time 2, the show's up, they now know what's the truth. So here, the way they respond at time 2 is going to be completely different from the way that they responded at time 1. Questions so far? Everyone good? Perfect. 5th, the issue of instrumentation. Your dependent variable just naturally changes between measurements. And the way that my instrument needs to be used needs to also change. So, for instance, with kids, when you ask children about self-esteem, can you ask a child who's 5 years old, child, whenever someone bullies you in school, how does that necessarily make you feel about your self-worth and self-esteem? Of course not, right? Child's going to look at you and be like, I like My Little Pony. Did I cut out? Okay. So the child is essentially going to ignore you completely and is going to say, dude, I don't know what you're talking about. But rather, what do? We have to come up with a solution. What's our solution? This is what our solution is. So let my screen load up here really quick. Okay. Can everyone see my screen? Okay, good. All right, so what do we do with little kids? We ask them the question, all right, when people say bad things to you or say things that hurt your feelings, how do you feel? Which smiley face represents you the best? Does this one? And here my drawing skills are awful, I am sorry. That one? This one? And the child goes, oh yeah, when somebody, says bad things to me or makes me feel sad, this is the way I feel. And they circle and you go, oh great, thank you. Now, ask someone who's an adult do that. Give that to an adult. So when someone speaks poorly about you, behind your back, how do you feel? Circle the face that represents you the most. They're going to be like, what am I, 5? Get away from me. So now all of a sudden, you have to now change your assessment tool because of the age of the individuals. Everyone with me so far? So what do? Now for the adult, we ask questions such as, all right, what are we going to be doing here? Is we're going to be asking you about your self-esteem. So on a scale from 1 to 9, please answer the following questions about your self-esteem. And now here we can give them a definition and they should be able to answer that. So here, my dependent variable, the way I measure my dependent variable needs to naturally change with time as well. Questions so far? Everyone good? All right, good. Okay. So number 6, participant selection. Participant selection is a huge issue for us in terms of internal validity or a threat to internal validity. And the reason that it's a threat or a problem for us is because participants may potentially join a cohort. What's a cohort, guys? You all should be familiar with this. It's a group. It's a group of people who share what? Something in common, whatever that commonality is, right? They all started school together the same age. They all like the same sports. They all go to the same grocery store, whatever the case may be. You form a little group or a little cohort. That becomes a problem for us. And the reason that becomes so problematic for us is because participants self-select themselves. We go through what's called a self-selection bias. That's a big problem for us, a self-selection bias. What is a self-selection bias? It essentially, just like it sounds, participants self-select themselves for participation in a research study. So if I send out an announcement through email to the class and I say, okay, I'm doing a research study on video games and their impact on aggression, who do you think is most likely to probably respond to say that they want to participate in the research study? Men or women? Typically males, especially if it's an aggressive video game. Who else? Men who are what? I'm sorry? Men and their friends, okay. Younger generations, absolutely. You're probably not going to get a 60-year-old in there. You might, but less likely. Who else? People who what? Okay. So other people who might have an interest in things of that nature, right? So here, well, what happened now to the generalizability aspect associated with this issue of self-selection bias? So now it's a problem for me because people self-selected themselves. So these people already come with the quality that the general population may not have in the first place. So in other words, experience playing video games. They may like aggressiveness, so on and so forth. But now we also have the issue of generalizability because now, do they really represent all video gamers? Probably not, because not all video gamers may want to participate in a research study. Not all video gamers are also very young. Not all video gamers may potentially like aggressive video games. Some of them might like sports video games. So you guys now get the idea. People come into the research situation because they have a vested interest in the project itself. Questions up to now? Everyone good? Number 7, attrition. We've talked about attrition. This is a problem with within groups research designs. People just do not come back for other measurement or for future measurements. In other words, people die between measurements, especially if it's a longitudinal study, people might die. Number 2, people move. People just don't want to come back. They just tell you, I just don't want to go anymore. People just forget, whatever the case may be. So here there's lots of factors that might contribute to attrition, but that's a problem for us because again, the people who might continue to come back might have a vested interest in coming back, might also just have the self-selection bias again continue to emerge every single time, and may potentially just naturally get better at the task because they continue to come back every single time, and by the 7th or 10th measurement, they're just better at the task than people who only came for 5 sessions. Questions up to now? Everyone good? Number 8, design contamination. With design contamination, we ultimately look at comparisons of groups in terms of who was the control group, who was the experimental group. So did either group have a reason to want to make the research study succeed or fail? That's a big question that we may have. Do they have a vested interest in that aspect? A couple of years ago, I remember a friend of mine was doing a research study, and they went and asked a bunch of their friends to come in and do the research study. Oh, come in and do the research study. Please, 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 I need participants. Awesome. So these people came in and did the research study. And we said, you can't do that. Why? They didn't know what the research study was about. Everything's okay. They gave me their data. We're solid. No. Because your participants have a vested interest in your success. So in other words, they may want to see you succeed, or hell, they may even want to see you fail, to be honest. So here, they may contaminate the study itself. Questions up to now? So here, what do we want to do? We may want to implement what's called a manipulation check. A manipulation check is essentially where we ask participants, do you have any vested interest in the project? Do you know the researcher? Had you heard about the research study before? Had you heard about what we wanted to do? Had you already come in to participate before? Everyone with me so far? So here, now we can identify if potentially anything that they may have experienced in the past might potentially be affecting the results that we're gathering at this point. In other words, we're controlling these multiple factors. Questions up to now? Oops, here we go. Let's see. Sorry. Number 9, compensatory rivalry. This is something that we see actually, this is actually something that we see quite often whenever it is that we're giving incentives. Whenever it is that we give incentives, we have to make sure that everyone receives the same level of incentive. Everyone receives the same level of incentive. That's very, very important to us. And the reason that we want everyone to receive the exact same incentive, no matter in what group they're in, is because if they're in the wrong group that receives less of an incentive than the right group, the one who received the most of the incentive, or the best incentive, the people who receive less of an incentive are going to see the people who receive the most incentive as being the enemy, and you're also the enemy, so thus they're going to screw with your results to give you worse data. Everyone with me so far? So here, you cannot offer group number 1 a steak dinner at a high-end restaurant, and group 2, 5 extra credit points on an exam. Did you guys hear me or no? Oh. Okay, so you can't offer steak dinner to group number 1 in a high-end restaurant, and for group number 2, offering them 5% extra credit on an exam. Because some people in group number 1 who got the steak dinner may not care about the steak dinner. They may not care about the steak dinner, and they may actually care about getting the 5 extra credit points. And some people in the 5 extra credit points may want the steak dinner rather than the 5 extra credit points. So now you have an issue. So that may potentially hurt your results later on. And last, factor number 10, resentful demoralization. And it essentially sounds like if this lecture is a demoralizing lecture not to do research. But believe me, research is fun. So here, resentful demoralization. If subjects learn that the other group receives less desirable goods or services, they may experience feelings of resentment and even demoralization. So the people who may have actually gotten, for instance, the steak dinner may feel bad that they got the steak dinner. So here, they may perform differently the second time around, or even if they got the reward before the experiment, they may perform in a different fashion because they may feel bad about having done that. So here, they may have gotten the good one, the good incentive, but yet they still feel bad for having gotten it. So here, as you notice now, there's lots and lots of factors that are going to affect just internal validity at this point. We haven't even talked about external validity and their potential threats that may exist. But here, these are just some issues to internal validity. Questions up to now? All right, so now let's move to talking about external validity. And ultimately, external validity really being how well our results generalize to the larger population. So we want them to generalize not only to our sample, because we really don't care about the sample, guys. I don't really care about the 15, 20, 100, 200 people who came into my research study. I care about the entire population. Because if I care about the entire population and how well my results generalize to everyone else, whenever it is that I resample from the same population and I replicate my study, or I even use the same techniques later on in a new study, using the same population, just a new sample from that population, I would expect similar results. Everyone with me so far? That would be an ideal situation. So here, we know that that's not going to happen every single time, but we try our best to have external validity being met. So I want my results to generalize across all individuals, across all settings, and across all times. So in other words, they should hold up to the test of time, essentially. So 100 years from now, if we do the same study or we implement the same manipulation to the population, we would expect the same results. It's probably not going to happen. So here, external validity can really be divided up into two different types, what we call population and what we also call ecological validity. In population validity, we essentially are asking the question, how representative is the sample of the population? So in other words, how good of a representation are these people who are participating in my research study for the population? So again, this boils down to the question of, is it fair for us to use college students to generalize to the larger population? And to be honest, I can't answer that question. My gut tells me that I shouldn't just use college students, but the practical side of me tells me, who else are you going to use, man? Do you got time to go to Walmart and gather participants? And the answer is no. Everyone with me so far? So the more representative I have my population, the more representative I have my sample of the population, the more confident I'm going to be able to generalize from sample to population. So the more confident I'm going to get that the sample and the work that my sample gave me generalizes to the larger population. So if I think of you guys, if I get asked to teach the same class in the future, and I see that you guys perform very well at the end of the semester, I'm going to assume that the manipulation, the techniques that I'm using all semester long, these techniques that I'm using all semester should then hopefully translate to giving people in the future the same success. Everyone with me so far? If I see that it doesn't work for the second sample, here now I have to rethink, well then what worked for my first sample? What worked for the first sample that didn't work for the second sample? So maybe there's a disconnect there, because here my methodology did not generalize to that larger population. Questions so far? So ultimately, we want our results to generalize to the population, even though in some instances my sample may not be the best representation, but at least if they're an adequate representation, I'm going to move forward, to be honest with you. Now, where do we see ecological validity coming in? This is essentially where we want now my external validity to move across settings. So population validity only referred to that subset of does it generalize across individuals from different samples coming from the same population, but now ecological validity looking at the degree that our results generalize across different settings. Because ultimately we want to say here, if you're in this situation or you're in that situation, we would see very similar results because we have ecological validity. Everyone with me so far? Now, is that a guarantee that they're going to work across situations? And the answer is no again. That's why we continuously are doing research, and sometimes we have to assume ecological validity, and in other instances, we have to do empirical testing for ecological validity. In other words, researchers have to try it out with different populations. They have to do it in different situations with different languages and so on and so forth, so that way we can actually see if we may have ecological validity. So ultimately, what are we looking at with ecological validity? We may be looking at potential interacting effects on testing, interacting effects of selection bias in experimental treatments. We may be looking at reactive effects of experimental arrangements, multiple treatment interference, and even experimenter effects. So in other words, even things such as who is administering the experiment or the treatment might potentially have an effect on the external validity. Questions up to now? Questions? Everyone good? Perfect. So let's look here at these issues of external validity and some possible threats. The first issue here that we have to consider is this aspect of an interaction affecting testing. What does it mean to have an interaction effect occur on testing? Well, essentially this means, for instance, that a pre-test interacts with the experimental treatment and causes some effects such that the result will not generalize to the untested population. So think of it like the following situation. Let's say that so we typically do this in statistics classes, or I do this in statistics classes. I give all my students a pre-test assessment of their fears of statistics. So one of the things that I do in that assessment is I tell them at the very end, there's nothing to be afraid of. We're going to work on it together. You're going to have my support. We're going to get through this. So now when we go through the semester, after having done that, I actually see that students are more willing to ask me questions. They're more willing to have an open mind about statistics, and they're willing to work harder because they feel now that they have that support. And they do. Everyone with me so far? Now, I have taught statistics classes where I have not done that assessment, that pre-assessment. And what do I find? That students typically try not as hard. They're more likely to withdraw from class. They're less likely to ask me questions. And I see more negative impacts on their performance. That's why now I include it in every single class I teach for statistics. Everyone with me so far? So here, that pre-assessment changes the way that my treatment is taken into consideration by the participant. So here, that's something I did as the researcher. I may have not wanted it to have that effect, but now it does. But now I roll with it because it's a good effect in my particular case. We also may see interaction effects because of self-selection bias and the experimental treatment. Again, going back to the issue that we just mentioned of self-selection bias, that participants self-select themselves to come in and participate in the study because they have a vested interest in the study itself, because they like it, or because their friend is doing it, or whatever the case may be. So here, if we would have randomly selected these individuals, we might have eliminated this potential effect of selection bias. But here, unfortunately, we may see it manifest itself in terms even not only of internal, but also of external validity. We also may see reactive effects because of experimental arrangements. So in other words, we may see things like the Hawthorne effect manifesting itself. So in other words, participants may perform differently because they're being observed by the experimenter or an authority figure. We've all heard of this, right? Absolutely. So your boss walks in, man, all of a sudden you become the best worker that's ever crossed that company, right? Man, I love doing this. I love doing that. And as soon as they leave, screw them. I hate doing this job. So now all of a sudden behavior goes back to what it normally should be. But here we know no better because this is what we see. We assume that what we observe is the natural behavior. Now we also may see that multiple treatment effects might interfere with our ability to have external validity. So in other words, having the same subjects receiving 2 or more treatments in a repeated measure design, in other words, in a longitudinal type study, we may see carryover effects exist, like as we did last week with within groups research designs, versus if we would have done a single treatment study. If we would have done a single treatment study, we would have not had to have worried about things like a practice effect or a carryover effect. In those particular cases, both the practice or carryover. But yet here, since we have multiple treatments or multiple interventions, we might now see different results manifesting itself and not being able to apply to the larger real world situation. So what do we need to remember? We need to remember the following. with this distinction of internal versus external validity. The top here we have internal validity and the relationship with our results. So my study design and the way that I implement my research study is ultimately going to make my results much more believable. So the better type of design that I have, the higher the internal validity, the more believable and more confident I'm going to be of my results. The better my results, the more likely it's going to be that they're going to be generalizable to the population. Hopefully. There's no guarantee, but that's what we hope for. Questions up to now? Everyone good? All right, so that's the end of lecture for today, guys. Before we end today's lecture, any questions that you guys may have? Just a couple of quick notes and reminders. On Thursday the 30th, I'm going to have the review session. It's not a requirement for you to attend the review session. The review session will be for 1 hour from 4 to 5 p.m. and that will be on Blackboard. On Blackboard, I will have the link to a YouTube video, a live YouTube feed of me essentially reviewing any questions that you may have. So here for the review session, you need to come with questions. I'm not going to go through the lectures again. I've already posted them on Blackboard. You've already attended them. But here, if you have specific questions, do feel free to come and approach me. If you cannot come to the review session, feel free to email me and I'll be happy to look those over. Number 2, your exam will be posted right after the review session is completed. So right at 5 p.m., your exam will go up. And that way you can begin to work on your exam, and that will be due until Sunday by 11:59 p.m. Again, that will be a scanned document, and there will be a link in Blackboard that you will click on that says Submit Exam here, and you will submit your exam. Questions, concerns, guys, before we end tonight's class? All right, have a good rest of your day. Have a nice weekend, guys. Enjoy your July 4th weekend with doing the exam. Good night, guys.